Yes, 15th of April, 2026. I'm about to start talking about chapter 2 in Gregory Shaw's Theurgy and the Soul, Neoplatonism of Iamblichus, which is called Matter as a Cosmic Instrument. So this is trying to elaborate on one of the principles of theurgy, which gives essentially a positive view of matter and of embodiment. Again, please go back to the context in the first couple videos of this series. But from here, so Iamblichus is a Neoplatonist writing in the 4th century CE, and he not only has a sort of particular reading and interpretation of Plato applied to ritual contexts, like it's a way of essentially, like he founded a Syrian school, a Platonic school, that gave great emphasis to ritual practice as a means of essentially enacting and embodying what Plato was talking about philosophically. And Iamblichus drew not only from Plato, but also a lot from Pythagoras about the essentially the archetypes of number and harmonics and geometry and mathematics, and how they are involved um, in a sense, a higher or advanced uh, kind of ritual practice having to do with the noetic, or literally, like, in a sense, that which is above. But before we get to that, Iamblichus also drew a lot from the Egyptians, Egyptian theology, and also Hermetic theology. And so from all of these sources, Plato, Pythagoras, the Egyptians, and the Hermeticists, he wants to then try and describe why we shouldn't fall into this trap of seeing matter as something fallen, and how it instead can be a vehicle, a way toward, let's say, transcendence in a word. And so, what I wanted to say about that, first of all, is I'm going to try and talk a little bit more about the Platonic Demiurge, and there's also a bit of stuff in here about Iamblichus's view regarding evil, which is a helpful kind of contrast to Jung. So, let's see what else I uncover. So, first of all, just to say, in this chapter 2, he Iamblichus asserts in some of his writings that there is a primordial and ineffable God. So despite all these sort of pagan influences, he goes on to initially assert you could call it a metaphysic, I guess. But for him, there is a God, which is sort of the first axiom, if you like. And then it's like a polytheistic system. So there's a whole hierarchy of different gods and angels and daemons and so on in this, um, version of Neoplatonism that gives great emphasis to religious practice. And Iamblichus, follows Plato in asserting that there is a kind of organizing intelligence, which Plato called the Demiurge, which is sort of derivative from this original primordial ineffable God that I mentioned. And this Demiurge brings order to matter, and it does so in a way that it's a kind of it serves a mediating function. It organizes matter in terms of the Platonic forms. Key insights here are that, like, there was quite a lot talked about in the first chapter by way of imitation. So the sort of principle that underlies this great emphasis given to ritual is that by imitating the work of the demiurge, one can come to align with and facilitate the expression of the divine in this world. And that may be the case. It's sort of like, okay, it's all very well to suggest imitation, and it if you sort of um, imitate divine qualities, you could facilitate their expression. Like, I can understand that. But what is actually meant by the demiurge, and how are we supposed to imitate it? And here's where I try to answer that a little bit. So in theurgic ritual, the idea of imitation, well, firstly, there's rituals, they involve specific material objects. So like imagine that there was a ritual to the god, let me see who I'm going to use today, Helios, god of the sun. And this is in the Greek pantheon, right? So, well, then there would be particular stones, particular songs, particular herbs, a particular like code of dress, um, yeah, like paraphernalia associated that are regarded to be associated with that god. And the idea is that uh, by bringing these things together in a symbolic way, literally symbol means to gather together etymologically, and invoking the presence of a particular deity or particular qualities that are personified in the form of a deity, that those qualities can, when we say invoked, there's also a quality of evoked, right? They're facilitated to be present. And what this does is it essentially arranges matter. It aligns that which is sensible or sensory with that which is um, intelligible or that which forms matter, but that which is above it. And I know that I'm sort of yet to unpack it and go into more detail about how that actually works. But the point here in connection with the Platonic Demiurge is that that kind of practice is an exact mirror of the what the Demiurge does in Plato's system. So that organizing, ordering intelligence brings harmony to matter according to the forms, the Platonic forms which are above matter. And in the same way, the theurgist orders matter ritually according to the divine logoi. Again, I sort of can't spend too long trying to go into detail about every term. And so imitation in this context of ritual theurgy means enacting the same ontological function on a microcosmic scale, the same ontological function as the demiurge, that is, which is, again, mediating between the literally the formal and the sensible. Okay. And just to be specific, that kind of practice is not about contemplation or about philosophy. It's about a certain kind of ritual practice that actually instantiates divine presence in matter. So it's a way of embodying and functioning as a kind of conduit through which the order which is regarded as divine can enter this material world. This conception of philosophic and religious practice, they lend a positive view to matter and to embodiment because those things are not a hindrance, right, to the ascent of the soul, or however you want to call it, but they end up being the medium through which we can get in contact with the divine and allow it to be present. There's also a deeper metaphysical claim which underlines that kind of approach to matter and embodiment, which is that the cosmos itself, meaning the universe, right, is actually incomplete without our participation in matter and embodiment. So whereas someone like Plotinus would say that our souls never fully descend into these bodies, someone like Iamblichus is saying, no, no, we actually are fully descended in these bodies so that we can bring the forms or harmony or order or the divine, all of those qualities to this existence. And in such a way, there's a way that kind of practice brings a sense of completeness, or you could say wholeness, to existence in a way that's not possible unless that participation in embodiment and in matter is taken up. So it's a kind of Hermetic philosophy. It's that is radically non-dual. And so rather than variants of Gnosticism or sort of kind of what Plotinus was getting at, but it's not quite the same to lump Plotinus in with the Gnostics. The point is that in this view, matter is not viewed as autonomous and evil. Um, Importantly, there's a metaphysic here of participation, which again I'm emphasizing again because it's like um, one of the things that Iamblichus does is also push back on Porphyry that our individual souls are equated with the world soul. So in this Platonic conception, the Demiurge, who we were talking about, gives rise to another kind of um, animating intelligence, namely the world soul, which is different than the Demiurge. And when our souls develop or progress in this way, this theurgic way, they come to participate in the world soul, if I'm understanding correctly, um, rather than be fully assimilated to it. So it's a metaphysic that gives a positive view to matter and to embodiment rather than regarding matter as evil, and which places central importance on the understanding that it's only by participating in specific practices, but also in the world more deeply, that the goal of all of these different philosophies like Gnosticism or Platonism, that of contact with the divine or transcendence or self-transcendence, however you want to talk about that, the ascent of the soul, um, is reached. All right. So I found something else as I moved through the chapter here, which is that Iamblichus views that all manifestation, everything that is sensible and intelligible, so the whole multiplicity of this world deriving from the one, is reducible to numerical principles. So this is the influence of Pythagoras upon him. And so I'm not talking about um, a mathematical view of the cosmos which is reductive. It's not about reducing everything to number. It's more to do with the archetypes of natural numbers, which are different. We will talk about that, but I'm not going to go into it here. Just to say that Iamblichus is taking this Pythagorean and Platonic view that there are these. It's that they're arithmetic, numerical, and geometric forms or archetypes that are not numbers, but they're sort of number is an expression of those archetypes. And these forms literally inform and enform the whole cosmos, the whole universe. And in this view of things, um, the soul on its way of development, in a sense, makes progress by bringing itself into harmony. You could say alignment with those principles and resonating in that way. So there's a kind of an immanent style of Pythagorean metaphysics that is sort of hiding behind, but it's not hiding, what Iamblichus is getting at. It's why we can end up in a space that ends up talking a lot about geometry and harmonics and also arithmetic and again the archetypes of number. So now I'm going to try to make a little bit more explicit the underlying bond between the topics that I was just talking about, the Pythagorean stuff on the one hand and the Platonic demiurge and the theurgic imitation of that organizing, ordering intelligence. And this is that the idea here is that this kind of creator God in the Platonic system doesn't create matter, but when he, I guess, receives it, molds it into certain forms and organizes those forms, organizes matter according to numerical ratios. So it's these Pythagorean principles that govern the ordering and organizing of the world itself. So in this system, this kind of created God is viewed as enacting a kind of rhythmic weaving, it's described as, between going up to the one and coming down into the many, into the multiplicity and into the chaos. And the Demiurge weaves those different poles of being into the cosmos, into the world that we experience, weaves them according to these principles that we were talking about of geometry and harmony and ratio. And that word, the Latin ratio, ends up being the root of not only the modern word ratio, but also rationality, literally to measure or in proportion. So this kind of view of things gives some priority to harmony and harmonization in a way which is kind of just, it feels to me distinctly Jungian. It's a way of, it's not just about one and many as well, although that is one of the sort of the key problems in Platonism, I guess. But part of the understanding here is that there's this, uh, again, it's an organizing, ordering intelligence that we can participate in by way of theurgic ritual worship, right? That holds different dualities, such as one and many, or unification and division. And when that intelligence holds these different dualities in that way, it ties them into a greater harmony, you could say. This is why in this Iamblican, Pythagorean, Platonic way, there always ends up being a great focus given to harmony because it's the principles of harmonics, literally like the rational ordering and organizing of the universe that governs the way that everything works. Just in the background, I can get a grasp here on what Viveki has called ratio religio. So these Latin terms, again, ratio or ratio, it's in a sense it's reason, calculation, proportion, and becomes modern rationality. But religio means to bind or binding, has to do with reverence and sort of in this context also religious practice rather than belief. So it's not about belief. And so the reason that this phrase ratio religio ends up being important is because here in this Neoplatonic system, but it's also a way, it's not just a system, it's a way of understanding that a religious practice is not so much tied to our belief, it's tied to what we participate in and the way that we participate in the cosmos. Because when we understand that the way that we are participating through all the practices that structure our life, no matter what our life is, that we can actually be more deeply connected to existence, we can be bound more deeply, then it changes our sense of what's important. It changes our sense of what matters. In this understanding, religion is not about what we believe. It's about, you could just say the way that we are, but in this context, it's about the way that we practice religiously and the way that that religious practice changes our mode of being in the world, the way that we participate, the way that we show up, in a way that is here seen to be inherently tied to not only reason, but the reasoning that literally governs and orders the cosmos, because it's like religious practice that aligns us, or you could say harmonizes us with the forms, like geometric forms, arithmetic forms, rational forms, they're like ratios that organize everything. It's quite hard to pull that down into words. Okay, if I move on here. Okay, so first of all, just in passing, the Pythagoreans apparently believe that there were 10 sort of kinds of relations that developed out of an initial opposition. So 10 ends up being deified by Pythagoreans in the form of the tetrachus, that like um 10 dotted triangle, which I won't talk about anymore right here. But it's in Pythagorean practice that was sort of worshipped because it's not just 10 in shape, it's also 10 kinds of here relations. So there's quite a lot obviously to that, which I will come back to. But now I want to quote from Iamblichus on the topic of evil in the context that I just laid out. So Iamblichus says, "Let it be thus for us. In the elements from which numbers arise, neither beauty nor the good yet exist. But out of the combination of the one and the causal matter of the many, number subsists. In these first existences, numbers, being and beauty appear, and in turn, from the elements of lines, geometrical existence appears, in which being and beauty are similarly found, and in which there is nothing ugly or evil." Okay, so just to say, to sort of reiterate, he's sort of talking about this initial, like we sort of in this again Platonic metaphysic, we have the one, and sort of the one and the many are derived from the one in a certain way, and there are these different kinds of relations or combinations that derive from that initial split, and numbers come from that, and other qualities like being and beauty, and then geometric existence and so on. And then he says, "But in the last of things, in the fourth and fifth levels, which are composed from the last elements, evil appears, not as a guiding principle, but from something falling out and not maintaining the natural order." Okay, so this quote reveals that in Iamblichus's view, evil is something which comes to exist accidentally, quote, from a kind of falling out and lack of control in the fourth and fifth grades of existence. So the difference here is that matter is not regarded as inherently evil, and nor is the human soul. There's a way that here evil is understood as deriving from a certain kind of disharmony or lack of alignment. This is again in contrast to Jung, who gives evil a substance of its own. Again, just in passing, one of the issues with this is that it seems to still, even though matter is not regarded as evil, it still seems that chaos is regarded as evil. So it's like the good is that which orders and aligns and harmonizes, right? And that's fine, but we were just talking about harmony, which includes cycles of order and disorder. And if evil derives from something falling out of alignment or out of harmony, if that's sort of the essence of what evil is, then how do we distinguish that from the kind of disorder that is actually necessary for, I don't know, creating a higher order unity or harmony? And so I have some resistance to sort of talking about the universe as inherently ordered and harmonized. Like, yes, but this chaos thing is sort of here to stay, don't you think? Seems that way to me. So the nature and origins of evil aside for the moment, the point that Iamblichus is making is that it's not fair to identify the material world with that principle. In fact, for Iamblichus, who's like pushing back pretty hard against the Gnostics and against Plotinus and Porphyry too, he sort of thinks that um, matter is again the way by which we can not only align with but give expression to the divine in this world, and that this actually has to do with the reason for our incarnating in these lives in the first place. There's another brief side note here which sort of outlines one of the main um, yeah, metaphysical axioms that Iamblichus seems to be working with, which again is that there's a kind of ineffable one which is prior to simple unity. So there's a way that unity and multiplicity derive from the one which is ineffable. He also gives these qualities of limit and unlimited, limited and unlimited, which also derive from that initial one. And so, like again, the mixing of these different dualities then gives rise to the cosmos in all the forms that we know. There is a little bit here that's worth including about the, in a sense, psychology of numbers as Iamblichus expresses it, which is obviously going to end up being quite important to me. So, for reasons that I won't go on about. So, again, Iamblichus is talking about an initial monad or the one. And from that comes a dyad or duality, but it's a dyad, a two-ness. And this was described as the mother of numbers. And quote, it serves as the matrix that transforms the monad into arithmoi. Now, what does that term mean, arithmoi? It means the mathematical harmonies that structure both cosmos and soul. And this is part of what I was alluding to when trying to talk about the archetype of number. It's that we're going to talk about from now on with that term arithmoi. It's like it kind of turned into arithmetic, or it's one of the etymological roots of arithmetic. It's not just about number, it's also about harmony, geometry, and ratio. These underlying archetypal mathematical principles that structure the whole universe and our soul. What we were saying about those principles is that the dyad, the two-ness, the mother of numbers that derives from the one, it serves as a kind of matrix or vessel through which that one becomes the arithmoi, becomes these uh yeah, mathematical archetypes. In this system, those relationships, those yeah, they're not just archetypes, they're also their way of mapping that which is between any two, and they're represented by the triad. And so, like from the one, these archetypes flow, and they flow through the duality, through the dyad. And that's important because it's also going to work the other way. The way for one to go from those, yeah, archetypes of number or arithmoi up to the one is through the duality, through boiling it down to something as simple as a dyad. And there's a couple of short notes that I have just to finish this off. So the first one is a quote from Iamblichus in, um, yeah, defending what Plato talks about in terms of a cosmos deriving from chaos. And Iamblichus explains that although the cosmos is eternally in being, the exigencies of discourse separate the creation from the creator and bring into existence in a time sequence things which are established simultaneously. Okay, so what he's talking about here is when we use discourse to describe the universe or the cosmos, as Plato was wont to do, we run the risk of misinterpreting or like creating models in a sense. So there's a way that our dialogue, our discourse is inherently dualistic in a certain way that Iamblichus is saying tends to reify this gap, this separation between the creator and that which is created. We see this, division in Christianity, or it's some branches of it, I would say. And I also just want to connect that to not only discourse, but the kind of linearity that comes not only because literally like when I articulate things, we have to articulate them one after the other, right? So there's a linear sequence which is implied as well. But also in the linearity of print, I think part of this is reducible to literally like the psychotechnology of writing. Um, and we see how Plato, in writing down what Socrates was only speaking of, lends itself to a certain kind of understanding, um, or misunderstanding, in fact, because uh, yeah, like Iamblichus is defending that Plato's not talking about chaos which is before cosmos that ought to be taken literally. It's something that is metaphorical, used to emphasize certain qualities of the Demiurge that aren't that important. But okay, so I wanted to make that point and a couple of other things. Firstly, is to clarify that Plato was describing creation in the Timaeus as a sequence of events, but although he described it that way, the work of the Demiurge is a simultaneous function. And so there's a way that this creating, ordering, governing intelligence is not subject to time in the same way that we as mortals seem to be at the moment. Because that's important because there's a way of, through ritual practice, sort of resonating at a level which is eternal, and eternal in terms of the eternal harmonics that adhere in all times and places, if that makes sense. Part of the reason that this is so important is because it implies that the cosmogony or creation of the world, like the origin of things, it didn't take place in a chronological past. So again, this has to do with the stuff from Henry Corbin and from Heidegger, that we've become trapped in this linear thinking that literally gives us a world that we live in. Like we have this idea that there was a past and now we're in the present and there will be a future. And that's a certain kind of story that's actually a myth that we don't even notice that we're stuck within. The point here is that this understanding that the work of creation by the created God is simultaneous, it's happening all at once. This gives us the realization that the birth, the origin of things, is not in some distant past, it's happening now. It's available now. And the fact that it's always present, but we're maybe not present to it, it means that birth, that genesis, that origin of everything, it's accessible, always accessible by means of theurgic ritual. And we're going to see later on how that becomes incredibly important for, yeah, there's a close connection between waking ourselves up from the trap that we've gotten ourselves into and literally giving birth to a new world. So connecting at the depth of cosmogony, the ongoing, evolving creation of things as they are, is going to end up being quite crucial, practically speaking. And the final point here is to come back to this discussion of evil that we were engaged in, where like we were talking about how, again, sort of the dyad becomes the mother of the divine numbers, and like the principles of relation that were symbolized by the number three have to do with the harmonics and ratios that order and govern the world. And so it's like, again, one becomes two and two becomes three in that way. But then they were talking about like the fact that evil doesn't inhere directly within matter. It's not that matter is evil, but that evil seems to arise from the sort of co-mixing of the fourth and fifth levels of existence. Again, that quote from Iamblichus, but in the last of things, in the fourth and fifth levels, which are composed from the last elements, evil appears not as a guiding principle, but from something falling out and not maintaining the natural order. So now I'm trying to get at what is meant by that, and I think the answer is that we don't know. I think there are in sort of New Age circles, there's a sense that there's a process of ascension that the Earth is engaged in at the moment, from the third to the fourth and fifth dimensions or something like that. I don't know enough about that to comment, but I think like the idea of there being different levels of being is compelling and evocative, and that certain modern takes on the process that's currently happening to the Earth are relevant to that. So I'm not quite sure what to make of this idea of there being fourth and fifth levels, and it seems that there's quite a lot of disagreement in the literature, this kind of literature, about what is meant by those. For example, this guy Gregory Shaw sort of follows authors named Merlin and Tarrant in assigning the fourth and fifth levels to respectively bodies and unordered masses. which to me is not very helpful because what the heck is an unordered mass? Isn't that just a chaos? Um, I don't know. So what I'm going to do is, yeah, I'll read the rest of the short paragraph that is relevant to that claim. So this guy again, Shaw, has assigned fourth and fifth levels to bodies and unordered masses, and then he says, in the De Mysteriis, his text, Iamblichus says, quote, "Whenever the soul comes into the body, it does not suffer, nor do the logoi which it gives to bodies. For the logoi are forms, ide, which are simple and uniform, allowing no disturbance to come in or out of themselves. The soul, moreover, is the cause of the suffering for the composite, and the cause is surely not identical with its effect." Okay, and that is all supposed to mean something. It doesn't mean very much to me, which is why it's difficult to talk about this stuff. So Shaw uses that to then refute the idea that souls and bodies can be assigned to the fourth and fifth levels, because even though the soul seems to maintain this intimate connection with the composite lives that it sustains, whatever that means. What Shaw says is, despite the fact that the soul is ungenerated and free of suffering, it nevertheless inclines and is turned to the generated composites over which it has jurisdiction. And to the degree that the soul's attention falls into these lives, it's subject to the suffering and evils that are their lot. What I would say, so what this seems to be is that the idea that in this sort of Neoplatonic metaphysic, the soul is inverted when it becomes incarnated. And that's regarded as like a necessary prerequisite of the possibility of the anagogic ascent back toward the Platonic one. As in, it's great that the soul is inverted. It's a necessary precondition in some way. But it also does make the soul seemingly vulnerable to falling out of alignment with the divine, right? And so it seems to be that like the soul can get tied up in these bodies, these lives, and we're so invested in our single lives that we don't even realize that that's a condition that we're in. But the idea here is that because we've forgotten all this stuff about who we really are at a soul level and our purpose in terms of bringing order and harmony and so on to the world in a Neoplatonic way, and also governing our own anagogic ascent, because we've forgotten all of that, we end up becoming subject to um, the suffering and evil of this material world. And I can certainly sort of get behind that. I can sort of see how getting tangled up in um, embodiment in an unreflective way and in the chaos that seems to go along with this material world can lead to great evil. But I don't think that that really does justice to what the origin of evil is. Like it seems to me that Jung definitely had a point in talking about the um, substance of the shadow, and how if we don't recognize that, we can tend to ignore and look away and be blind to the evil which is present in this world. Like it seems like the problem of evil is kind of that's kind of what's going wrong. We're not recognizing the shadow. And I think Jung, more than anyone else, pointed to that. So it does leave this question open. What is meant by the fourth and fifth levels? I don't yet know, but it's going to become a key question. Okay, I'll leave that there as this is a way, it ended up being very metaphysical. But what this is supposed to have talked about is matter as a cosmic instrument. So this is a way of understanding how matter itself and the body are both governed and organized by these mathematical principles or arithmoi, which again are mathematical harmonies that structure both cosmos and soul in a phrase. Um, through ratio religio, through right religion, essentially, through religious practice in this form of theurgic worship, we can embody and express those archetypes those qualities of relation. And there seems to be a way that by boiling them down into dualistic form again, and then being able to, I would say, in ritual contexts, take up the perspectives of each side of whatever duality. As in, what does it feel like to be in multiplicity? What does it feel like to be in unity? What does it feel like to be in the quality of being limited? What does it feel like to be in the quality of being unlimited? Can we experience that directly, existentially? Um, this is a way of religious practice, clearly. But what I need to come back to from here is not only deeper into the stuff about geometry, but how, like to me, that those first three levels seem quite clear, but then not wanting to get stuck in the triad, which from my point of view would be a mistake. But the fourth and the fifth, what is meant by those, and how are they relevant to the origins of evil? So I'm going to continue in discussion of the third chapter, Matter as an Obstacle to the Embodied Soul, in this work by Gregory Shaw, Theurgy and the Soul, Neoplatonism of Iamblichus.